I would like to welcome you to the final session for today, a panel discussion on a very exciting topic, the acceptance of cryonics in science and society. And I think it's a topic we've all thought about, discussed about very often. And the question is, why are we here as all dozens of people and not hundreds? Why is there so few chronicists? What are the obstacles? Both, as it said, in science and in society. And we'll certainly also discuss how these are linked. I'd like to welcome the speakers here. First, Peter has already been introduced today, so I'll just add a short word of thanks. Peter is also one of our members in the German Association. He speaks excellent German. And we are very grateful for his contributions, also to our mailing list, for his input and his insight. Second, I'd like to welcome Max Moore. He's also been introduced today, so again, I'll just say one thing, that we, especially here in Germany, are extremely happy with the international approach AGA has been taking with the deployment of the field cryoprotection. I think in November there will be the first training session in England with the new kit, right? So, well, maybe a couple of us can join as well, so we really look forward to that. And well, I think it's a great thing that Cryonics is working together internationally so well, as we can see here in the conference too. Next, I'd like to introduce Aubrey, who I guess in these circles doesn't really need an introduction. Aubrey is well known for the SENSE project, which, well, I've seen what, well, from the beginning, sort of how Aubrey built this up, pitching it at conferences, until with really great insight, and which led to him to have the SENSE Research Foundation founded in 2009, which does so many exciting stuff. So I'd like you to check that out on his website, and of course also, if you haven't done so already, his book, Ending Aging. Finally, I'd like to welcome Ben Best. Ben is a long-time Cryonics activist. He served on the board of the Cryonics Society of Canada in the 90s. Then he was president and CEO of the Cryonics Institute from 2003 to 2011. And now he's Director of Research Oversight at the Life Extension Foundation, which many of you certainly know and which has played a very important part in cryonics in the US and worldwide. And I'd also like to mention his website at benbest.com, which contains an excellent collection of articles on many topics, including cryonics. And these are really erudite and encyclopedic articles, which are benchmarks for many of the topics to get informed. So please give a hand to all of our excellent speakers. So, well, we have the panel discussion in a way that will open the floor to the audience for your questions. And I'd like to start off with a question of my own, which is really simple. Which is the one thing you would think would cause a breakthrough in the acceptance of cryonics in society? So, limiting it to society alone, what would be like the one thing which would cause mainstream adoption, people, you know, standing up to sign contracts? What do you think would be the one crucial event?
Proving that it works.
Okay, good. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, I think that most people...
Go ahead. Mike, thanks.
Well, I think most people think it just don't work. It's nonsense. And that's a big problem. If we could do it, and a human being could do it with a little animal, the world would pop up and say, this is interesting. These people are making progress. If they can bring back to life a little mouse that's frozen to liquid nitrogen and it's still alive and working, that would be so impressive, the world would change. But we can't do that yet. Yet.
I'd like to believe that, but I'm not sure I do. I think if we brought back a human being, yes, it would definitely have a drastic effect on people. If we brought back an animal of some size, it seems like it should have a drastic effect, but I'm not sure it actually would. I'm not sure. There's actually quite a lot of evidence already that cryonics is working, that it's actually preserving people, and yes, not being able to bring things back is a big obstacle. But I worry that actually that won't have as big an impact as we think. It's very hard to say which one factor is the most powerful, but it's hard for us to imagine since we're all pretty familiar with cryonics. But I think a pretty drastic problem, apart from, one basic one is they just don't understand cryonics, they don't know what it is, they think it's freezing dead people, and that's how they think of it, and that kind of frame makes it almost impossible to be accepted. But I think one really big difficulty is one that's a bit more subtle, more psychological, is that many people actually fear that it will work, and so they don't want to believe that it will work. And even if we bring back an animal, they still don't want to believe that it works. Because it's very hard for us to imagine this, but I've talked to many, many people, and I rarely hear that, oh, it can't work. Usually I hear that, well, what if it does work? What am I going to do in a future where my skills are obsolete, I don't know anybody, and all the science fiction they've seen shows a horrible future. So I think one of the main things we have to do is reframe those assumptions, try to get them to see how they will actually be pretty decent, and they don't have to be alone, they can bring their friends and family, and we'll have organizations that will help to reintegrate them, something that we're not doing a very good job of right now. It feels like they're kind of throwing them into the future and leaving them alone. I don't think we've done a good enough job of showing that that's not the case. So I think that these psychological barriers are actually more powerful than the lack of a good demonstration, not that that isn't important.
People want to die, you say.
They'd rather die than face the future uncertain.
Yeah, I think I agree with Max. I would say that's probably not one single thing. I think really what's going to happen is that a variety of different incremental advances will bring us, very, very minor incremental progress, whether it be reviving a mammal or getting really good at cryopreserving and then using organs for transplantation, which of course a number of people working in cryonics research are focused on in the short term. But yes, it's really all about somehow reaching a tipping point where there is sufficient public enthusiasm and indeed public adoption by opinion formers and by people that people care about, that it acquires a life of its own, so to speak. I think that there will be a tipping point. It won't be it won't always be a gradual process of more and more people coming along. But once we get to a certain point, very suddenly it will become embarrassing not to be in favour of cryonics. But exactly what will be required to reach that tipping point, I'm really not sure. I think that Max's point about the psychological barrier is very true. It's certainly true in my own work as well, that many people are very, very much too willing to come up with objections to the desirability of indefinite longevity, and then immediately to switch their brains off and not be interested in looking for reasons why their so-called reservation is actually nonsense. And I think the same is very much true with cryonics.
Yeah, well, I guess I just have to agree with the rest of them. People do, I think what Aubrey's working on is related to the problem. People thinking of aging as a disease and not thinking really in terms of extended youth and extended life being something desirable or achievable. And as far as it is a bit like fax machines and telephones. You don't want to be the only person on the planet with a telephone. Once you're aware that once people around you know people who've made this decision, then you'll start thinking you won't be alone, and also once you're convinced that you'll come back in a condition of youth and health, and understand that and appreciate that that's valuable, because that's going to make a difference. Well, I guess as long as also people need to understand that this isn't sacrilegious, that it's not that there's no 11th commandment that says thou shalt not be cryopreserved, that they're not violating God's will. I think that'll influence a lot of people. And lastly, scientists are very subject to social pressure. That, you know, their status in the scientific community is very important to them, and I guess most of them look to experts who have expertise outside of their own field. And as it stands now, the experts in Society for Cryobiology, for example, are saying it's all hogwash, and so I think and scientists just don't like to look foolish or stupid, or like they're not on the leading edge of what's a real science. So that needs to change.
I think it's dangerous to sort of have an animosity with scientists. I think we should work closely with scientists. I'd like to ask the panel a question. If you ask people on the street, would you prefer dying when you were old or living in some way? What do you think the percentage would want to die and end it all? When we look at all the religions in the world, Christianity, Islam, they promise some sort of heaven and immortality. And I think all of these people eat that up. What do you think if you ask people now whether they would like to live forever or die? To me, you give me the impression that most people are not interested in this movement for some psychological reason, which is not liking life. Can you give me an estimate?
I think, I'm not sure I can answer the question on those terms. I think really the way they think of it, however you phrase the question, they're going to think the question is, would you like to live longer and be a weirdo, or would you die? And they're going to choose to die.
Really?
Yeah. So if it's socially acceptable, yes, they want to live. Just think about the contradiction between what people do at the end of their life when they know they don't have very long. They may only have a few months, maybe a year. They'll spend vast amounts of money and suffer miserably to live just a little bit longer. But when faced with something like cryopreservation that could give them much, much more life, they say, oh no, I don't want to do that. I'm not interested. So there's something already twisted going on in the thinking there. So I think posing that question, you will not get an answer that's actually truthful, because they're going to rationalize it, because they're afraid of being weird.
What do you think the percentage of people that you talk to outside, not here, would tell you they'd like to die and get it over with and not live forever as a cryonicist? What percentage of people would do that, roughly? 90% of the people, or 10% would choose death? I would think 90% would choose life.
Maybe, I mean, I guess, do you have any answer, Peter? I mean, are you referring to specific...
Well, I'd just like to see their feeling about the world outside. Why would only a small number of people here, why the rest of the world?
Micro, please.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, to answer your question, I'm pretty sure, actually, that Max is correct, that the vast majority of people would choose to be normal, and to die when it's their time, so to speak. And I think a large part of how they rationalize that is they wouldn't say they want to be normal. They wouldn't say that, well, at least most people wouldn't say that they want to do it because that's the standard thing to want to do. But rather, they would rationalize it in other equally irrational ways. They would, for example, put out of their minds any suggestion that such a life would be an enjoyable, youthful life. Now, again, I have the same problem in my own field. People are incredibly resistant to hearing that and to remembering that we're not talking about keeping people alive in a frail, elderly state of health. It's the same kind of deal, and especially when we have the issue that Max mentioned of people having it very strongly ingrained in their heads that people who are cryopreserved are in fact dead, and therefore that the whole thing is kind of internally contradictory. You know, then we're faced with a massive psychological problem.
Does Ben want to answer that?
Oh, you can certainly also, if you have any questions here from the floor, just raise your hand and then we'll, I mean, unless you want, okay, so is anybody carrying up the mic? Or
Please, maybe just speak loudly.
Yeah,
We have also mic.
I'll speak loud. Referring to your first question, what will change people's minds? I got, after thinking a long time, another approach. If you could show people that they have to die, that they really understand what this means, death, then they would be here with us, I guess.
What do we what? What's that last thing?
If you could people make understand what death is,
yes.
because they don't know. They say, okay, we all have to die, but this is only speech. They don't feel what it means to die. And this is out of several reasons.
I think almost anyone, if you hold a gun to their head and say, do you want to live or do you want to die, or I'll pull the trigger, they're going to say, don't pull the trigger.
Exactly,
but it's a matter of how far you look ahead and what do you think, where do you think life is going. And people. I mean, dying in 5 minutes or dying very soon is very different than the far-off future that you can't.
Exactly. If you could make them lay on their deathbed now, just for imagine, if you really could get that, and I try to do it by art. This is my approach now. I'm writing theater plays to show the audience what death is, how miserable.
You want to teach them.
Yeah. The experience of death, so that they really just talk like that on that, but that they really have to watch it 2 hours, what death means.
I don't think I go to you.
This is like shock therapy, I guess.
That's an interesting thing. I'm not sure, you might get locked up if you're trying to do that, but it'd be interesting to see what the results are. Let me turn that around a little bit. One thing that I think we do need to do, and many of us in this community, life extension in general, I think often don't do it, we need to avoid certain words. We need to avoid words like immortality. We need to avoid words like forever.
Yes.
Because that pushes those psychological buttons like, oh my God, I've got to plan out the next billion years right now. What am I going to do? And we have to convince people that's not the way you're going to live an indefinite life. You don't have to plan the next billion years ahead. The next few days, the next year enough is enough. People have this reaction all the time, apart from the idea that, oh, you're going to be bringing back as an old person, which is a very common one. We have to remember to explicitly say that's not the way things are, because people assume that. The other thing is the terror of an indefinite lifespan where they think they have to deal with the whole thing at once. We have to be very careful to avoid that. So don't use words like forever or immortality.
Did I do that? No. Sorry.
Yeah. So I want to agree with Max and make fun of him at the same time by saying that I think we need to go further than that and avoid words like transhumanism, because really what's I think part of the problem here is that as futurists, as visionaries, people who look forward to considerably more powerful technology of any kind, we tend, when using language like this, to separate ourselves from the present day, and what is much more effective is to emphasize the continuity with the progress that we are all familiar with, that has occurred recently. So, just as, for example, in aging research and longevity research, we indeed avoid, as much as we can, well, I certainly do, words like immortality or even longevity, except to the extent of pointing out that longevity would be a nice side effect of staying healthy. Similarly, in other technologies, it's useful to emphasize, for example, that artificial intelligence is really no more than a good deal more progress in automation, for example.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on that. I don't disagree with that, Aubrey. I think obviously the place to discuss transhumanism, but I always try to avoid that in the context of cryonics because, as you say, it's just adding on more things that we have to buy into and they scare them off.
More shock levels, I guess, in a way. Hey, Gilbert, do you want to tell us?
Give me a microphone, please.
I think it's better if we do have a microphone in the audience.
Yeah, you have one, yes. Thank you very much. If you, in your mind, get into distance from this very detailed situation, when you look at you, or if someone from the outside would look at you, or at us, at Cryonics, he would say they have an idea, well, a more or less crazy idea, working on them for about 50 years, and are, well, not so successful. There are about 2,000 or 3,000 persons who are believing or following these ideas. And if you compare, on the one hand you could say, well, that is the problem, the idea is complicated or, difficult to explain, and this is the problem why it is not so successful. But if you compare it to other organizations which have, for example, as idiotic ideas, they are very much more successful. For example, if you compare it, you know of Scientology, this kind of religion founded at nearly the same time in the 60s. And the idea of Scientology, from my point of view, is much more idiotic than Cryonics is. And why? I would say so. I hope there are no Scientology members here in the audience. I'm an athlete, so it's nonsense for me. But in comparison to you, they are much more than 100 times more successful than you. They have hundreds of thousands of members. At least 100,000 or 200,000 of members taken in the last 50 years, whereas you, with the same idiotic idea, only reached 2,000 members. What do you think, from this point of view, what is the problem?
What does Scientology promise?
Scientology, I think I don't know it in detail, but they think that there is a contact to an outer star, alien persons that have contact to, and when you are paying a lot of money and making courses, you can, have a life after death and so on. I don't know it in detail. Does anybody know Scientology religion in detail? You can read it in Wikipedia in 2 minutes, I think. It's absolutely crap. It doesn't differ in detail from other religions, but it's created 50 years ago. It's based on science fiction ideas.
Well, look, what Scientology offers that we don't, well, a couple of things. One very specific and one more general, both of which are very powerful. One of which is it offers a guaranteed plan for personal success. Cryonics doesn't do that. In fact, it tends to make it more difficult for people to be successful. They keep quiet about it. So it has a technology, supposedly for personal success, that's offered as something that's really going to work. And along with that, the way it's offered and the whole belief system behind it is based on certainty. It's not based on reason or evidence. It's based on certainty, just like all religions. Whereas Cryonics, okay, you pick up a contract, I don't know what CI's language is like, but I imagine it's similar. Our course contract has several pages of disclaimers that this may not work because the technology may be never developed, the organization may collapse, this may go wrong. It's full of disclaimers. We're almost shooting ourselves in the foot if we go too far with that, emphasizing, oh, this probably won't work, but at least it's a chance. I think we've actually done a terrible job by being too diffident, too uncertain in expressing the probability of this. Whereas they're offering certainty, just like all religions. All you have to do is believe and you will be saved. Whether it's believing in Ron or believing in Jesus, whatever it is, just believe, have no doubts. Whereas we're encouraging doubts with pointing to the evidence. We're not even appealing to emotion very much because we feel that's kind of dishonest. And I think that makes a huge difference in success levels. Now, I'm not advocating that we start offering certainty and ridiculous promises. I think we'd probably grow a lot faster if we did, but that would be dishonest. But we could probably do a bit better job of not overemphasizing the uncertainties. I think we need to be a little bit more positive in our own favor.
I think you're very positive. I think the movement is very positive, and you're right. I think, to me, I think it'd be more cautious to show how difficult this thing is. It's not something that's guaranteed. We have a very, very long, tough road to do what we would love to do. What about your question? Why don't you like the word forever or the word immortality? Why are you censoring these words?
I'm the one who mentioned those words.
What's wrong with using the word forever or the word immortality? They're good words.
I can tell you what's wrong. The fundamental thing that's wrong with using such words is that they blur the distinction between what is technologically conceivable and what is technologically impossible by definition. We know that there is a difference between, for example, eliminating aging on the one hand and eliminating all risk of all causes of death by any means, which is what immortality is historically meant. So if one refers to the former using a word that is already defined to mean the latter, then one is asking for trouble.
In a way, I guess immortality is not a scientific word, is it?
That's what I say.
Yeah, it's also puts you, it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. It's putting yourself directly in conflict with religion. And really all we can honestly offer is life extension anyway. And so and religion, life extension is not in conflict with religion, but immortality is.
I think whenever you use the word immortality, you always qualify it with additional comments. You don't use it as if it's guaranteed. You say immortality in a way, or because of this. You don't use the word isolated. I hate to censor things. I feel that these are good words. And to me, forever is a very, very moving word, because I hate the concept of being away and gone forever. I find it a good word, and I don't like censorship.
Well, nobody's censoring. You can continue to use the words, but I'm just suggesting that they're a bad idea, and I think Ulrich's saying the same thing. The way I try to frame cryonics, one of the first things I usually say when I'm talking about it, people having a tour with the media or whatever it is, I like to first of all begin by framing cryonics as an extension of emergency medicine, or an extension of critical care medicine. That puts us into the mainstream. That takes us away from freezing dead people in competition with religion forever, all those things. It's simply doing what medicine's supposed to do, which is to help you not die. And I think that's a lot more effective, and people understand that a lot better and feel a lot less afraid of that than any talk of immortality, whether you hedge that with other words or not.
Actually, I'd like to ask the audience a question about that, actually. And this is something that maybe has already been discussed many years ago within the cryonics community, for all I know. I'm a relative newcomer compared to everyone else up here. In contrast to the panel up here, which is made up entirely of people from the three nations that have had the greatest support in cryonics over the past 40 years, of course there are many nations represented among the audience here. And if we take what Max has just said, and we take it to its logical conclusion, we should be thinking in terms of biting the bullet and advocating a definition of legal death that is considerably more damaged, so to speak, than today's conventional definition of legal death. If, for example, there were some actual country, some jurisdiction, in which legal death were defined in such a way that the highest standard of cryopreservation that is achieved today, you would not be declared dead, then we have a rather different situation. First of all, you can't pay for your cryopreservation with life insurance anymore, but of course you can pay for it with health insurance, in principle. And secondly, one starts to be able to speak much more plausibly about the idea of elective cryopreservation, which of course is something that has come up a lot in this community. So what I'm asking really, what I'm interested in hearing opinions on, and also information about, is what is currently the range of definitions of legal death that exist in different countries around the world? Is there a range at all, or is there some kind of international treaty that says it's all got to be this way everywhere? And to the extent that it might be extended, how would that actually be brought about?
Good question.
Anyone? Maybe Ben can tell us whether that has been discussed in the past.
Well, one of the major paradigms in cryonics has been information theoretic death, which is, in my mind, a concept that's hard to get your mind around, but it's the state in which the information in your mind and your personality has been so destroyed that it can't be restored, such as being thrown into a blast furnace, for example. I don't find the information theoretic death very helpful, and I don't think there's any country in the world that's going to be accepting that, aside from the fact that it's hard to define.
So, we've had one lawyer drop out of the presentations today already, so I feel kind of cold. There's not a lawyer in the world who can answer your question already. The definition of legal death had to change out of necessity only, because we were able to transplant organs, and that was a game changer. And across the world, there isn't a jurisdiction that has clearly tackled the problem and managed to solve it, you know, for now and forever. People have found ways around it, people have found words to describe what we probably mean by death in certain circumstances, and all of this was under the intense pressure that it needed to be resolved, and we muddled through. So the chance that the Cryonics movement will get similar pressure built up in order to change the paradigm across the globe or in just specific jurisdictions is lamentably small. I wonder though, with your look back, and we've had another speaker drop out who would have given us such a look back, and some people can speak to it much more authoritatively than I can, but there isn't a word that was said on the panel thus far that wasn't raised on similar panel discussions before I was born. How can we make the Cryonics movement much more acceptable? People will correct me, but I understand in the 70s, it was rather expected that by the year 2000, oh, scary date, we would have cremation, we would have burial, we would have Cryonics. They would be on par. Rational people would, you know, choose among these with equal likelihood. As it's been mentioned, the Scientology sect has been much more successful since, with words like immortality. So, what are the things that we could be discussing on a panel today that are really cutting edge, and not just about the science, but about the movement of Cryonics that we couldn't have done, well, let's say 10 years ago? Could any of the panelists speak to that?
Someone would like to repeat this?
You're dodging my question.
Well, it was Aubrey's question first.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Hello. I think that the legal definition of death has historically been what it has been for pragmatic reasons. Legislators will love legislating because that's what they know to do. But pragmatically, it's whether a doctor thinks they can revive you or not, and the legislators have to go to the doctors and ask them what the latest way they can revive them. The whole information theoretic thing is just purely a thing to argue after Cryonics meetings. And it's picking up something that was a bit earlier, the reason, it's so easy to sell some nonsense, and people like magic, they don't want reality, so telling them that L. Ron Hubbard will come down from another planet and take you away, as several of you said, is an absolute certainty. And unfortunately, the problem is with certain parts of Cryonics is it drifts off into religion, and I've actually sat there and had demented, arguing with people who are dementedly saying, no matter what you do, as long as you freeze something, in whatever condition, we'll be able to bring someone back. And I've even heard people say, look, even after mathematically it's been shown there is no information there, they just have looked at me and said, yes, but one day we'll come up with new mathematics. Sometime in the future there'll be new mathematics that can solve this information theoretic death. It's a terrible thing to get to. So coming back to the legal thing, I think there may be a situation where you can have a third definition. It isn't just, and this is also one of the problems in Cryonics, is people see you as being either alive or dead, And that argument that everybody's had, but when you're dead, which is just not actually really an argument, but people will come up with it time and time again. There has to be some kind of stasis, legal definition of someone in stasis, which is just, from a religious point of view, just limbo. It's an old concept. The very word stasis is you don't expect someone in stasis to have to go and sign on to the dole or send off their insurance, and the laws would be set up that once you're in status you would count as if, from a life insurance point of view, that your life insurance would pay up because you're unlikely to be brought back at a reasonable time. And the insurance companies would only complain if people started doing this early. They wouldn't really complain, they just put their prices up. They'd all manage it, and it would both be practical from our point of view because we'd be able to get people into stasis in better condition. And the third concept would stretch people, the general public's minds a bit. So there we are, thank you.
The medical community already accepts that there's a distinction between legal death and clinical death, and that's been accepted since the 1950s when cardiopulmonary resuscitation was developed. So I think people are recognizing that. I mean, usually when your heart stops, that's the criteria that most physicians will use. But I mean, obviously, if you can restart the dead but not ultimately dead.
Then we need to get both the public and legislators to accept that there's a third state.
Of course, there are two different questions here. The question of whether there is an instantaneous point at which you go from being alive to being dead or not is one question, and Max wrote a PhD on this question, if I remember rightly, more or less. Clearly, we only have. Clearly, that's not the case. Biologically, death is a process that happens over a finite amount of time, and the only reason we have the concept of an instantaneous death is as a social convenience. But that's rather separate from the question of what clinical state a doctor is authorized to declare you dead at. And I think it might be of value to the community for someone, some historian of science maybe, or historian of law actually, to compile a reasonably comprehensive treatise of how the legal definition of death has changed over time and what brought those changes, what actual process brought those changes about, whether how rapidly a change was adopted by most countries following its first adoption by one country, for example. I think just a summary of those facts, or perhaps a rather detailed exposition of those facts, could give us some new ideas.
Well, there is definitely quite a lot of that work around. For instance, the book by Karen Gervais, its title I forget, but I read that in reference for my chapter of my dissertation dealing with that. And there is a clear history of different kinds of death. For instance, there was just kind of standard death, and then in many countries there was a criterion of brain death, and there are very specific drivers for having that new definition of brain death. And then there's another step from that to neocortical death, because there are questions about what organs you can take at what stage, and so there was an actual specific motivation for having different kinds of death. So maybe, as Gareth's suggesting, as I think some of us would agree, we don't even have a good word for it yet, but there should be some kind of third condition where you can be declared only kind of slightly dead, or almost dead, or in this third state, whatever we want to call that.
Purgatory.
Let's not call it purgatory. So that it would be a state which has a different legal status from being alive, because clearly you're not going to be able to execute contracts and so on, but it's a different legal status from being dead, because then you lose all rights in your existence. So it would be something in between. We have some legal precedents for the other end of that. We talk about, okay, well, if you give someone this third state, what kind of complications? What will they come back eventually? Isn't that going to confuse things? Well, not really, because we have law like that right now. We have people who are presumed dead, lost at sea, or presumed dead, and years later they come back and say, hey, I'm alive. And there's a process for giving them back their social security numbers and their passports and their identity, so it's not really that complex. So I think what we need to convince enough people that there actually is this third state, and that it should have a different moral status. And nobody's going to buy that until we're more popular, but yeah, I think that's the right direction to be going in. So we don't have this binary problem of either alive or dead, which everybody is stuck in that mindset nowadays. And we can already show that's not effective even today, it's not adequate even today.
And I mean, we were talking about acceptance of cryonics into society, and law is always one of the last things to sort of be changed when society changes. As Sebastian said, the laws on being declared dead are changed like at the last moment to accommodate social changes. So I would guess if we did have that sort of third state codified in the law, that would be a strong signal that cryonics, or at least the ideas of cryonics, have been accepted in society. I would like to switch now, however. The panel is called Acceptance of Cryonics in Science and Society. And we've talked a lot about society so far. And of course, there's a very long and fraught history of cryonics in science as well. And obviously, given that the bylaws of the Cryonics Society for Cryobiology is still in effect, cryonics is not accepted as science, at least in these quarters, and there's still quite some bitter fighting and suspicion and stuff going on. So maybe looking forward and retaking that question from the scientific perspective. What would be something which would change the minds of the, what would we, maybe put it like this, what would be something which would cause a bylaw in the Society of Cryobiology to be changed? What would be something that cryonics would be accepted as a legal thing in the scientific mainstream? In the way, by the way, that aging research has been, or anti-aging research, has been accepted in the US at least. I mean, here in Germany it's still a very hot topic. But in the US, I feel more and more scientists are coming out and saying, you know, I want to stop aging, I want to make, restore youth. And that's seen as legitimate. Cryonics is not on that level of legitimacy. How could it get there?
By publishing scientific articles that the cryobiologists would referee and agree with, and be impressed with your scientific activity. We really are not in the mainstream scientific channels. Known very few people. The only thing I heard of was the kidney transplant of Fahey and Wook. And I've told that this is anecdotal. That's the only real publication in the last 20 decades, or 10 decades, on this subject. We have to be more scientific, I think. I happen to be a scientist, so you have to convince the scientists that we're making sense out of things. And we publish papers that show success of some sort, even if it's small. For example, just reducing the Audrey Smith barrier. She was able to bring her hamsters back from 0 degrees. No one has been able to bring any animal back from lower than that. Suda brought some artifaction, not artifaction, really very poor responses back from a cat that was put in a freezing compartment. That is not quite as good as Audrey Smith's work, but we need to do scientific publications that are refereed and accepted by the cryobiology community. That would give us a lot of stature.
I agree with that. I would add that I think making individual connections with influential research is going to be very important to bridge the gap. For instance, you might have read earlier this year, because it was in many different science magazines, about research being done at the University of Arizona in Tucson, along with the Pittsburgh Hospital, by Peter Rhee and other people. The idea being to do low-temperature surgery, surgery on human beings at a temperature that's never been done before, down at just 10 degrees C. That's really pretty chilly. It's nothing very special to us based on our research, but that's kind of a radical breakthrough, the idea being that we have about 4 times as much time to do the surgery with slower metabolism. Now, the lead researcher, though, one of the 2 lead researchers, actually came to visit Alcor. And we were kind of expecting that he'd sort of, maybe laugh at us or say, I'm not even going to come, or I don't want to be associated with you. But no, he actually came along and he listened to us. He said, well, that makes sense. What you're doing is rather more radical than what I'm proposing, but it's basically the same principle. And he even said this in the media. And that's pretty impressive, because this is a guy who's an eminent surgery researcher. He's the president's personal physician on some of his trips. So making individual contacts like that, individual people showing that you're real and you're serious and it's based on science, can make quite a difference. The other thing I like to observe is that there's this infuriating tendency of arrogant ignorance on the part of people like Michio Kaku, who's a popular science presenter and has a physics background, who is quite happy to go on the internet and make a video about how cryonics is just nonsense, because obviously the ice forms inside the cells and expands and blows them up, which is just not true, but hadn't bothered to do any research. And you hear that thing over and over again, oh, the cells will burst. It's like trying to turn hamburger back into cow. Bollocks. That's just not true. We have to keep replying to these people. We have to get in their face and tell them they're wrong. As I did with Michio Kaku, make a rebuttal video, try and embarrass him, challenge him to come visit. We have to push back on these people because other scientists who aren't experts in that area will hear that and just dismiss the whole thing as a fantasy. So we have to keep correcting that basic misconception. So correcting misconception of making personal contacts with eminent research.
Next, before you go on, to sort of dispel this myth once and forever, can you quickly say, because I'm not sure if everybody knows, why this is clearly erroneous that ice will form inside the cells and rupture the cells?
Ice, when cells freeze, the water tends to freeze extracellularly rather than intracellularly. So it's just because the proteins and other components of the cell are sort of naturally vitrifying, but those components do not exist outside of cells. So when freezing occurs, but I mean in both cases, of course, there's freezing damage and the tissues are destroyed by freezing, but it's not because the cells are. It's not because it's just a technical detail. The freezing doesn't happen inside cells; it happens outside cells. But even so, it's true that ice expands. Has a 9%. Ice has a 9% greater volume than water, and the cells end up being crushed rather than bursting from the inside.
If you don't use cryoprotectants.
Well, of course, I'm talking about straight freezing. But of course, these scientists will ignore vitrification altogether and just talk about the fact that there's freezing damage, ignoring the fact that we try to vitrify our patients. That's another problem. That's really cryonics is viewed with such low esteem that these so-called scientists can not study the subject, not know what we're doing, not knowing that we're trying to vitrify or that we are vitrifying, and just make these statements because attacking cryonics or discrediting cryonics is a cheap shot. It's easy to do. One more thing though, and that's I think a lot of people also are aware that frogs can freeze and so forth. And they don't freeze to liquid nitrogen temperature or the way we do, but a lot of people are aware of this phenomenon. It doesn't seem to have made a big difference to them. I mean, this is an animal that mostly freezes and comes back. And also, we don't say that our cryonics people are dead. We say they're patients. They're metabolically challenged. So in the cryonics community, we have this terminology, but it's not a terminology that's accepted outside the community.
So this is going to be the first time in the session so far where any of the panelists have had a chance to disagree substantially with any of the other panelists. I would like to somewhat depart from what Peter said in response to the question, because I don't think it's as simple as publishing scientific papers. I think that the process of gaining scientific credibility for a radical new venture should, in principle, be achieved exactly in the way that you described by publishing papers. But the thing is, we do publish papers. I mean, sorry, the people in the field who are doing the most important work certainly publish. Greg Fay, in particular, has taken great pains to give a very low profile to his cryonics interests throughout his career, precisely in order that he can carry on publishing in the main publication of the Society for Cryobiology. And that he's still recognized as the foremost, is one of the very foremost cryobiologists in the world. But it hasn't helped. I would say the reason it hasn't helped. Well, the question is, what would be enough? Enough in volume or enough in amount of progress? So the example you gave was, if we can revive a mouse, then the scientists are going to come on board. Of course they are, but then the scientists cease to be the problem because the public will come on board as well. The problem is when a scientific community feels threatened by the prospect of discussion of a new direction, for example, because they feel that it's going to bring their own work into disrepute or in some way diminish its relevance. That, I think, is certainly the way that cryobiologists have historically felt about cryonics and why the opposition to cryonics burgeoned so rapidly when it did. I certainly again see the same thing in my own field when I started to bring the idea of regenerative medicine as a route towards combating aging into gerontology. It was a very hard sell at first, and it was a hard sell largely because I was talking about considerably greater life extension than anyone had any right to talk about before that. So I think it's a great deal here is about the special case of situations where an established scientific community feels threatened and gets defensive and starts to use its authority as a way of suppressing the new idea.
Thanks. So I'm fairly new to, it's the first meeting I come, but I certainly come from a more of aging perspective. And one thing, you were talking about engaging researchers and other scientists, and give, for example, the example of Michio Kaku. One of the things that people are working on aging have done to try to engage, because there's still quite a lot of opposition to anti-aging research. But one of the things that some of us has done is, you organize a meeting and you invite some of your opponents to give a talk, and then hopefully when they see the other talks and see it's not just a bunch of lunatics, that will in turn teach them about the field and also convince them, hopefully, that this will be worthwhile. I don't know, is that possible in cryonics? I guess cryonics is a smaller field than the aging field, and I don't know what would happen if you were to invite Michio Kaku to come to this meeting. Maybe he will just decline, but is that possible?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Kaku has not taken up my invitation, but at the last Alcohol conference a couple of years ago, we did invite Sebastian Xiang, who wrote the book on the connectome and had a bit of discussion of cryonics, and they're fairly skeptical, but also obviously willing to consider it, basically putting out a challenge, not even having read all the evidence in favour of what we had. But I contacted him and said, come explain to us why you think cryonics doesn't work or under what conditions it might. And he accepted. And unfortunately, as soon as he arrived, one of our directors, Ralph Merkel, immediately berated him and jumped on him. But he was very, very good. He was very willing to discuss it. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to do to build bridges. And in fact, our next conference will be a year from now. So if anybody has specific suggestions for people to invite, I would like to do that, either as a debate or for them to present their point of view and engage with us. So I would love to get suggestions on specific people to invite.
Yeah, I think perhaps even more valuable than inviting some high-profile public figure in science like Kaku or Bill Nye or whatever, would be to invite a prominent member of the wider cryobiology community, and in particular to invite senior members who have expressed strong skepticism in print or on camera about cryonics in the past, and to see whether that would make any difference.
Peter Mazur is the guru of the Society for Cryobiology, so if you can get him, then he's at the top.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of my point. If you get someone like that to come and you get them to actually even slightly become mollified about the plausibility of cryonics and to say that they may have overstated their case in the past, then that can be quoted to people like Michio Kaku and get them to understand that they may have outdated opinions.
Can I just check with the panel? I talk to people active in cryobiology and I've tried to publish a few papers myself. I never got the feeling that there is a cryobologists community of any note in Europe. There are journals, next to no conferences. It is a very, very underfunded field. It's not one that you need to be chubby about because you can get your publications placed elsewhere as well. and you can't get any money anyway, because there is no distinct funding stream for cryobiology. All of these people hitchhike on, in vitro fertilization efforts in order to freeze sperms and eggs, and that's where all the money is coming from if you're doing cryobiology research. So why is the cryonics field so upset as a really small field? I guess if you challenge 6 cryobiologists who really style themselves such, and you struggle to find 6 of them, one of them would know what cryonics even was and care. So why are we so hung up about this angle? I don't really know.
Because of the way that scientific authority works. Scientists know that they don't know much about much, and therefore when they want for any reason to actually have an opinion about something that's outside of their own field, they will look to the opinion of someone that they think knows more than they do. And that goes all the way to the top. And it doesn't matter how small a field is. If there is a field at all, even if it's really tiny, the people who are dominant opinion formers within that field will ultimately have an opinion that filters down to the entire scientific community.
I mean, one point I could make is certainly that it's in articles on cryonics, it's been de rigueur to always have a cryobiologist at the end who says it's all rubbish. And that leads to my next question, because Aubrey, you're certainly very familiar with that. And I remember there was a sort of prize, I think it was in Technology Review, right? Where you basically challenged scientists to prove that sense was rubbish. And well, I think you clearly won the prize. I think Technology Review tried to get out of it a bit. But maybe you can, one thing is, you could say like what was the impact of that, both in the short and the long term? And then maybe the others can say, what about doing something like that for cryonics?
Yeah, I mean, actually, now you mention it, I'm slightly embarrassed that I didn't think of that myself, because it was a very powerful step forward for science. We had gone through a period of a couple of years when I had been talking about these ideas and everyone had basically ignored me because they knew that I had said a bunch of reasonably sensible things over the previous few years that were nicely harmless, and now I was saying all this crazy nonsense. They kind of felt that he'll come to his senses fairly soon. And then when the media started getting interested, it all became a little bit more antagonistic, and there were a couple of years when I was subjected to really rather a lot of ridicule, but it was all off the record, and that was of course the problem because one couldn't really respond. So as you say, in 2005, I was able to take the opportunity of the publication in Technology Review of a really remarkably insulting couple of editorials and the readers' reactions to that to work with Technology Review on this prize, which was $20,000, half of it from them and half from us, for demolitions of sense. Demonstrations that sense was so unscientific that it shouldn't be considered worthy of debate. And as you say, it worked fine. Of course, nobody tried to. Nobody was claiming that sense was definitely right, only that it was a promising approach. And yes, this brought out. I was amazed that anyone was so dumb as to actually submit an entry. I was thinking that the best that could happen would be that I would be able to taunt my critics with their cowardice. But in fact, people did submit entries, and there was one entry in particular from a consortium of 9 reasonably well-known gerontologists, which was a spectacular demonstration of what I've been saying, in that a number of criticisms were put forward that were all very obviously either based on misunderstandings of sense or on simple ignorance of published literature on which sense was based. So yes, it was a great way to move forward, and certainly over the subsequent 3 or 4 years, I would say, as the dust settled, a large number of prominent gerontologists who had previously been either staying silent or even being quite publicly opposed to what I'd been saying shifted very substantially in my direction. And the result has certainly been very productive in terms of the mainstream acceptance of sense within the scientific community, within the gerontology community, and of course thereby in the wider community. So yes, in the idea of doing the same kind of thing for cryonics is quite fascinating, and the only real question is how can one engender a sufficiently high-profile opportunity to do it. Technology Review, of course, was quite a prominent magazine, still is obviously, and as such the publicity for the thing was quite substantial. I think that's what would be required, and I'm not quite sure how that could be done, but I bet there's a way.
Hello, me again, sorry. That, thank you, was terrifically inspiring, actually, because it had occurred to me about that a prize might be a good idea, but I had always thought of things like the X Prize, which was a huge amount of money, and I had no idea that your prize was only $20,000, and half of it was put up by the magazine. I mean, come on, we can get together $10,000. That's, you know, I'll put the first $100 in. $100 in. That we should do that. And Cryonics gets more ridicule and more publicity than, because, you know, he's always at the end of the news, he's an idiot who's having his head frozen when they run out of things on a quiet news day. That would be just brilliant, and I didn't realise it was such a small amount of money. Do it seriously. I'm putting I'll put in more than $100. I'll match anything that anybody else. Well, no, I won't, just in case there's someone very rich here today. But we'll do it. I'll put in the money.
Tell me, what is this prize for?
To do the. Aubrey will explain it to you afterwards. What he was just saying. To have a prize to get Technology Review or whoever we find to say how Cryonics is complete rubbish, can't ever work, pile of cobblers is nothing, and then explain exactly why. And then we'll come in and we will need a lot of input from Aubrey to see how he did it so that he won. But that was just being good at knowing his field, I suppose.
Actually, that was. So just a brief mention of that part. So in fact, the thing is, I was actually able to do this quite easily, because by the time that the prize idea was being hatched, the editor of Technology Review was rather on my side. What had happened, you see, is that the original, insulting stuff about SENS that was published, he published only because he had talked to it, of course off the record, to a number of prominent experts, and been told, yes, you can perfectly safely say what you like about SENS and Aubrey, he's obviously completely crazy. And so what he did first, when he got a lot of blowback from the readership, was he went back to these experts and said, well, you know, you seem to have got me into a bit of trouble here. Could you possibly, as such, write me a nice succinct demolition of SENS that I can publish and put this whole thing to rest? And mysteriously, none of them could find the time. It was all rather amusing, and he rather rapidly got the message that he'd been hoodwinked. So he and I rather colluded in creating something, and the format of the prize was, of course, the key thing. It wasn't just that people would submit an entry, but that I would then get a chance to write a rebuttal, and then both documents, as a pair, would go to a neutral panel of experts, people who were engineers or biomedical people, but who were not gerontologists. And that's how it all worked out.
And to which we've got to do it. We have to do it, people.
But we have to do it in a high-profile way. So you mentioned the X Prize. I actually, some years ago, was able to get Peter Thiel and Peter Diamandis together, and I very nearly pulled off a Cryonics X Prize. But in the end, Peter Thiel was not willing to put up the money for something so unambitious as to be doable within 10 years, which is the kind of criteria that Peter Diamandis had for what an X Prize should be.
But that's why I was always thinking of the X Prize. But to do it for $20,000, and we only have to come up with half of it. I mean, that's great. That's what we should do. And the publicity for it. Michio Kaku, I've seen that, and I've seen Max's rebuttal. And I mean, the man's not. When I say the man in this case, I mean Michio, not Max. The man's talking out of his backside. I mean, just obviously rubbish. I mean, nonsense for a high-profile public scientist. Not the simplest bit of research he must have done, and he was just recycling the old myths. And not last year in the UK, Darren O'Brien did his thing with his sidekick when he came out with a frozen and thawed carrot and said, "Look, it's all wobbly." And I mean, excuse the French, but shit that they come out with. And they're high-profile public people, supposedly public scientists and all the rest of it. It would be fantastic to give them a kick up the arse. Thank you.
I think Marcus.
Short comment only. Why not technology review again? I really wonder if that editor has learned his lesson.
Well, I'll tell you why. So, even though he was cooperative in creating the prize, because he knew he'd been somewhat hoodwinked, nevertheless, he was absolutely certain that an entry would come in that would win. And when that didn't happen, and indeed when a number of entries came in that were unceremoniously thrown out, he realised that he had a great deal of egg on his face, and that's why half the prize, he actually unilaterally awarded $10,000 to the best entry, even though it was rejected. You know, tried to make it look as though it was kind of an honourable draw. And so, yeah, I think there are lots of things that he would do rather than do this again. It was definitely not something that he found fun in the end.
We'll find someone.
What has this got to do with cryonics? I can't follow this sense debate and tech.
Oh, well,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's the question of motivation. If you publish the question, if someone proves that cryonics cannot work in principle, it will be paid a price. And we are convinced that no one will be able to prove that in a scientific way, that cryonics is not possible in principle.
And prize offer for that?
The idea was to offer a prize to prove, to have for a scientific proof that cryonics does not work. And from what my question is, from my point of view, it doesn't matter if it's Technology Review or another newspaper. If the price is high enough, and 20,000 is not a sensation. Sensation would be $1 million, for example. And the question is where to take $1 million from. And so is my question.
You're saying that someone offers $1 million to show that cryonics doesn't work?
Yes, we have it.
Is that the point? That
$1 million
is showing that cryonics doesn't work.
In principle, cannot work in the future. That it's.
Don't you want to stay out of such dilemmas and such debates? Don't you want to avoid these things and just stick to science?
No,
it's just argumentative and causes friction between the scientific community. Just avoid these people if they make statements like that. To me, it's an awful waste of time.
It's hard to avoid these people if Michio Kaku listens to them.
I think the best thing is ignorance and ignoring Michio, whoever he is, just ignoring them.
They have the network, the scientific network. We cannot ignore them.
Stick to our main goal, to try to show that you can preserve.
But Aubrey said that he has good experience with such a kind of scientific confrontation. But now, please, the question, what I want to ask to CI, to a former director and to Alcor, because we have $1 million. And I know that the patients trust you and trust for your handling of the money. But if you would give $1 million for a scientific proof that cryonics will not work, if this proof will happen, so if someone will prove that cryonics cannot work, then you don't need any money anymore. So it would, and my conviction is that you will not lose the money. So there is absolutely no risk if you would say we give $1 million for a scientific proof that cryonics does not work.
It's not their own money.
You're trusting the judging panel.
lose the
Yeah,
judge.
in that sense, no risk. It depends on the judging panel. In this case, you managed to get pretty reasonable people. It would be very difficult in cryonics. It actually be probably more difficult because they have to understand not only that maybe the cryobiology, but also what kind of technology, which we don't really know yet, maybe in the future.
Right. The definition of this price must be very pedantic, very precise, not just proof that cryonics does not work, but this is the headline. But in detail, it must be precisely specified what to achieve to get this price.
Yeah, but also there's no way the patient care trust fund is going to put up $1 million for that because that's not patient care money. Now, maybe we have money in our reserve funds, maybe we could raise money for that kind of purpose if we needed that large amount of money, but it's not coming out of the patient care fund, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, from my experience with the technology review thing, I would say that actually the definition of the prize is relatively easy. One can simply say that one has to that the winner would have to demonstrate that the revival of someone cryopreserved with the best technology available today is so implausible that it's not worthy of scientific debate. That's more or less exactly the language that was used in the technology review thing. But I agree with Max that the really hard part is to make sure that the that the prize judges are appropriate people. What happened in the technology review case was that all but one of the judges were actually identified by the magazine. There were 2 biotechnologists and 2 people who were actually from the IT world, Nathan Mervold and Rod Brooks. Very prominent people, all of them. And the one that I brought in was Craig Venter. So it was, obviously highly respected people. Now, in terms of what they already know, what their expertise is, it's really the important thing is what their expertise is not, such that they will not be seen as in any way biased either positively or negatively, and will not see any reason to be biased positively or negatively, not to be part of either the pro or anti-cryonics community. And that's probably not very hard, but they've got to be really high-profile people.
I would be most impressed if the judges were members of the Society for Cryobiology. I don't think that they would honor any other group as being more qualified to be judges. And as I mentioned before, Peter Mazur is probably amongst the Society for Cryobiology the scientist held in highest esteem by all the other cryobiologists. And as a matter of fact, Peter Mazur has made a statement to the press is that I think it can be proven that the possibility of cryonics working is so low to be virtually zero. And he made that statement, but I've never heard what his proof is.
And it's doubly qualified, right? He thinks it can be proven that it's a very low probability. So.
Yeah, I think certainly Mazur is the sort of person you want to be submitting an entry. I think the judges need to be people with absolutely indisputable credentials in science or technology generally. Members of the National Academy, things like that. That's what you need.
Okay, I think we have time for like a last round of questions. I see there's one over there. Is there anybody else who would like to have? Okay, then I'd say we'll have those two. Yeah, exactly. We have these 2 questions, and then we'll finish off with the panelists. So.
Thank you.
Did some of you try to make a contact to Arthur Livingston, Calico, Google, because there might be money and maybe prestige? People love Google.
So, of course, Calico, our Livingston company, is not likely to work on cryonics. Okay. We are doing our best to make contacts and to develop contacts with Calico, but obviously, if we had got very far, I wouldn't be able to say so.
Okay.
Hi, my question is sort of for everybody, but as we're here together as a community in Europe, what I'd like to know and get the panel's opinion on especially is what do you think we can do personally as myself, not being directly involved in cryonics research or knowing too much details about the current research in nanotechnology, as how can we persuade the public opinion to be more open to the idea of cryonics in terms of how we talk about it? Is there something we can do to create more accessible resources that would be open to, say, non-scientifically inclined people who might not know anything about it? And how can we sort of focus our efforts in a way that's not as fragmented in terms of having different groups, but having something we can contribute to or participate in to help the movement of cryonics in general?
I just want to make one point on that, which is that I'd encourage people who are involved in cryonics, who are advocates of cryonics, to actually go out and advocate. Because it distresses me how many people, I mean, when you join alcohol, one question you get is, do you want to be private or public? And a lot of people choose private. And it always makes me want to slam my head against the wall, because if we're going to be private, if we're going to be so embarrassed that we can't tell anybody else that this is what we think is right or makes sense, we're not going to grow. One of the most powerful means of growing is not necessarily me giving interviews, it's everyone individually going and talking to their friends and saying, hey, I'm interested in this really interesting idea, can I talk to you about it? Now you don't want to put on a suit and say, have you heard the truth? You don't want to have that kind of approach. But just cautiously have a friendly conversations, bring it up occasionally. If there's something in the news, say, hey, what do you think of this? And then discuss it, listen to them, see what their feelings are, what their objections are. And probably what we need, maybe this exists, but I don't remember seeing one, maybe we should have a little primer on how to talk to people about cryonics, how to talk to your friends. I know there's been a couple of articles on it, but I don't think there's a good point-by-point guide dealing with some of the common objections. So if you don't do it every day, you may not be a master of that. But I think that could be a very powerful thing. So if it's just a couple of thousand of us in the world, well, if each of us can get one person to do this, suddenly there's 4,000, and then there's 8,000 and 16,000. So I think that's one thing everybody can do, unless you really are an obnoxious person and shouldn't even be associated with cryonics. But most of us, there are people we can talk to, and we need to do that more, not be embarrassed about it. I'm here, I'm cryo, you better get used to it.
Yeah. I'd like to follow up on that. I'll give my turn to Peter in a second. I think that's a very interesting fact. I certainly agree with it. I wonder whether it can be done in a kind of indirect way, which wouldn't be so effective, but might have some effect, by Alcor and CI themselves. Here's a suggestion I've got for Max. To get one of your staff to actually go through the entire membership list, and for each person, just check whether they have a Wikipedia page. Okay? So divide them into those two groups. Okay? And then, first of all, see whether the people who do have a Wikipedia page are more likely to be public than the people who don't. Right? So, in other words, see whether being a public figure is a disincentive, or whether that disincentive is somehow outweighed by one's, self-worth or ego or whatever. And then one can use, having got those statistics, one might be able to use them as a way of getting the word out. So, for example, if it turned out that only 20% of members are public, but 40% of members with a Wikipedia page are public, then this is kind of, the public figures are leading by example, and you can kind of use that.
I think I'm outnumbered on this committee, but I want to reiterate the point. The most powerful way that we can impress people and the scientific community is by publishing impressive papers related to this field. That's the most important thing we can do.
Okay, so I think we just briefly mention for Alcor members, if you're an Alcor member, you haven't, you should have already received one of these, but what we did not too long ago, a couple of months ago, is we sent out 2 free associate membership cards to all existing Alcor members with the strong suggestion that hand these to one of your friends. Basically, it's giving them a free year subscription to the magazine and has a number of other benefits. It's a little foot in the store strategy, so you don't have to sign on to buy the whole idea. Just, take one of these if you're sufficiently interested to get the magazine and a few things like that. So I think these very incremental strategies might help a bit too.
So that's a very nice closing remark directed to us. Get out there, spread the word. Maybe Ben or Aubrey, do you have any other closing remarks you'd like to say?
Just for a point of clarification, the mandate of Calico is to create a community of scientists, somewhat like Bell Labs used to have many years ago, who are working in the anti-aging field. I don't know, maybe something like the Buck Institute, but something more of a community of collaborating scientists. And my understanding is they're not going to be spending their money on creating anything else. And
that's news to me.
The other point is I really disagree with Aubrey in terms of I think if you're looking for judges, the judges that are going to be viewed as being most competent are going to be members of the Society for Cryobiology. These are the people who are the most respected as being knowledgeable about the technologies involved in cryonics, not somebody who has expertise in some other field of science.
Well, no, it certainly wouldn't have worked if the judges in the technology review thing were from the mainstream gerontology. Then I would definitely not have won.
Okay, so, well, there's one thing I'd like to remark. I mean, there has been quite a bit of disagreement on the panel, so it was a very lively discussion. I really like that because I think it shows we're generating hypotheses, we have different ideas, and so maybe one really good idea will pop out to really bring cryonics either to the mainstream or into scientific full credibility, but it might also be a long incremental process, and I would like to thank all of you for playing a part in that as well. And so, thanks again for this wonderful discussion, and please give a hand to our panelists.
Yeah, let's also thank very much our moderator, Thorsten, for keeping this